Last time we spoke about the fall of Smolensk. The Wehrmacht, having swiftly advanced through the Soviet Union, aimed to open up a path to Moscow. Under General Fedor von Bock, the Germans launched a major assault against Soviet defenses led by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. Despite early successes, German forces underestimated the resilience of the Soviet army, which regrouped and mobilized hidden reserves. As the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, the Soviets under General Vasily Vatutin organized a counteroffensive. On July the 15th, intense combat erupted in Smolensk, with German troops steadily encircling the city. The Red Army, despite suffering heavy losses, showcased determination by relocating factories eastward and outproducing their enemies in tanks and aircraft. By July the 16th, Smolensk fell to the Germans, yet the battle revealed underlying vulnerabilities in the Wehrmacht. The fierce resistance from the Soviet soldiers hinted at a critical turning point in the war. This episode is Hitler's Summer Triumph Turns Bitter. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I released a rather silly episode looking at how Japanese anime portrays the Pacific War today. To be honest, it's actually going kind of viral. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 28 episodes and ongoing now, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As July of 1941 draws to a close, the Eastern Front plunges into a harrowing new chapter, characterized by escalating brutality, adaptive strategies, and a profound exhaustion. Amidst all of the chaos, the Red Army grapples with staggering losses. Yet while they are battered, they are also beginning to exhibit a remarkable capacity for strategic learning and resilience under relentless fire. Often overshadowed in discussions of the Eastern Campaign, naval operations emerge as a crucial element in this conflict, unfolding across vital waterways such as the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and even the Arctic. These operations highlight the expansive and interconnected stakes of this monumental struggle. Key developments during this period include significant reorganizations within the Soviet command, intense encirclement battles in Ukraine, and renewed offensives around the city of Smolensk, a strategically important location approximately 400 kilometers west of Moscow. Smolensk's position made it a critical hub for transport and supply in the region, influencing the broader course of the war. As the fighting intensified, the outcome of the encounter hangs in the balance. Both the Axis and Soviet forces are faced with mounting challenges amidst the chaotic escalation of the war. Now, the Eastern Front of World War II was predominantly a land and air conflict, a reality shaped largely by the vast and varied geography of the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe was assigned a critical dual role in the Eastern Front, to establish complete control over the airspace by decimating the Soviet Air Force, and to provide essential ground support for the Army's main operations. In the initial phase of the campaign, long-range air attacks targeted industrial centers in the distant Ural Mountains. However, this was never deemed a priority. Instead, these operations were planned to follow the completion of the mobile offensives. While it is commonly believed that Germany's Navy, the Kriegsmarine, played a minimal role in the Eastern Front campaigns, this perception overlooks the nuanced involvement of naval forces. While the Kriegsmarine was a large, powerful, and professional force, its effectiveness was hampered by the need to divide its assets across multiple theaters of war. This limitation significantly restricted the number and size of ships that could be deployed in, let's say, the Baltic Sea, particularly as the conflict intensified. At the onset of Operation Barbarossa, on June the 21st of 1941, the German naval forces operating in the Baltic Sea comprised a modest yet effective fleet. This included 28 Schnellboote, or fast attack boats, 5 submarines, 10 mine layers, primarily converted from passenger liners and ferries, 3 squadrons of M-class minesweepers, 3 squadrons of requisitioned minesweepers, which were often trawlers, 2 squadrons of R-boats, these are light coastal defense craft, 2 squadrons of patrol boats, typically made up of trawlers, 3 speelbrecher, or block ships designed to create obstacles, 2 depot ships for minesweepers, and a variety of naval tugs, transports, and auxiliary vessels. Later on, in September of 1941, Germany established the Provisional Waffenflotte, a naval task force designed to confront the Soviet Baltic Fleet. This flotilla boasted impressive assets, including the battleship Tirpitz and several cruisers, such as Admiral Scheer, Emden, Köln, Leipzig, and Nürnberg, as well as the destroyers Z-25, 26, and 27, and the 2nd Torpedo Boat Squadron. The primary mission of the Waffenflotte was to eliminate the Soviet Baltic Fleet if it attempted to escape to, let's say, neutral Sweden. However, this scenario did not materialize. Aerial reconnaissance indicated extensive damage to the remaining vessels of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, leading to the disbandment of the Waffenflotte before the end of October of 1941. Germany's ally in the Baltic Sea was, of course, the Finnish Navy, and while quite small, it was a professional force equipped to meet the demands of its strategic objectives during the conflict. In 1941, Finland's naval strength comprised the following key assets. She had 2 coastal defense ships, the Ilmarinen and Väinämöinen, which provided essential firepower and protection for Finland's coastline, 5 submarines, Ysihisi, Ikotorso, Vetehinen, Isikko, and Sako, which played a vital role in disrupting the enemy shipping and gathering of intelligence, 4 sloops, Torema, Kajala, Ysima, and the Haminma, tasked with various missions including escort and minesweeping operations. She also had 3 mine layers, and these ships were crucial for establishing minefields in strategic areas to impede enemy movement, 12 minesweepers essential for clearing navigable waters, allowing safe passage for friendly vessels, 7 motor torpedo boats, which were fast and agile. These boats were capable of launching surprise attacks against larger enemy ships. In addition to these primary vessels, the Finnish Navy also utilized several auxiliary craft, enhancing its operational capabilities during the war. Notable amongst these were 4 sloops, reassigned mainly as escort and minesweepers, further expanding the Navy's capacity for her coastal defenses. She also had 6 cutters. These are smaller vessels employed for escort duties and minesweeping operations, demonstrating versatility in combat situations. 17 VMV-class patrol boats, and these are quite small, serving multiple roles, like acting as torpedo boats, gunboats, sub-hunters, and so forth. Obviously, their enemy was the Soviet Baltic Fleet, which was commanded by Admiral Vladimir Tribuz throughout World War II, which was one of the largest of the Soviet 4 fleets. Initially, the fleet was limited to bases in the eastern corner of the Gulf of Finland, but it quickly emerged as the most formidable naval power in the Baltic Sea. As the war unfolded, the fleet expanded its operational capabilities by utilizing naval bases in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This expansion began with agreements imposed by the Soviet Union in autumn of 1939 and was solidified following the occupation of the Baltic states in June of 1940. Additionally, the Soviet Baltic Fleet benefited from territorial gains made in the peace treaty after the Winter War, acquiring valuable naval assets, including a base at Hanko and another access along the coast of the Karelian Isthmus. Now, prior to Operation Barbarossa, the main naval bases of the Baltic Fleet were located at Liepāja and Tallinn. As of June of 1941, the Soviet naval strength in the Baltic included quite a diverse array of vessels. She had 2 battleships of the Gungut class, 2 cruisers of the Kirov class, 2 leading destroyers of the Leningrad class. Modern destroyers, she had about 17, comprising 3 types, the Type 7, 13, and Type 7U, as well as the Opni. She had 7 older destroyers, including 2 Izyaslav class and 4 Orfi class, plus a Yakov Sverdlov. She had over 65 submarines. She had a bunch of escort vessels and gunboats, mine layers and minesweepers, a ton of motor torpedo boats, and other auxiliary vehicles. But despite all of these assets, the fleet faced increasing challenges as German forces advanced, which would soon impact their operational effectiveness. Now, the Winter War, along with the occupation of the Baltic states, had positioned the Red Banner Baltic Fleet robustly within the region. By June of 1941, it was definitely the largest navy in the Baltic Sea, boasting all of the ships I had just mentioned, as well as a naval arm of over 709 aircraft. With well-established bases along the entire Baltic coast and in Hanko, the fleet posed a significant threat, particularly as the long and vulnerable southern coast of Finland became exposed to Soviet naval presence. The Finnish Navy consisted of two main branches. The first included the old but well-maintained coastal fortifications built by the Russians before World War I, known as Peter, the Great's naval fortress. The second was the active navy, featuring all the ships that I had mentioned. However, the Kriegsmarine could only deploy a small portion of their naval forces in the Baltic, as the majority were engaged in the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic. Germany's primary concern in the Baltic Sea was to safeguard the supply routes through the Archipelago Sea that were vital for importing iron ore from Sweden to support its war industry. The Nazi invaders strategically leveraged the strengths of their military, a framework deeply influenced by decisions made in the 2 decades leading up to the war. Despite this, naval aviation was largely neglected, and the concept of constructing a formidable navy to counter a Soviet threat was kind of dismissed. Instead, the Kriegsmarine's planners primarily focused on countering the Royal Navy, with whom's attention was given to also the French Navy. Consequently, the German Navy was ill-equipped to provide substantial support in the Eastern Campaign. However, this does not imply that the Kriegsmarine was entirely absent from the conflict. For instance, logistical planning for Army Group North included provisions for transport by ship, primarily from the Prussian coastline. After the capture of Riga, located on the southeastern shore of the Baltic Sea in early July, this city became a vital logistical hub. Its strategic position enabled the timely movement of troops and supplies, which were essential for sustaining the German advance deeper into Soviet territory. When the Germans launched their surprise assault on the USSR on June the 22nd, the Soviet Navy was caught off guard and suffered substantial losses during its withdrawal from the Baltic states and Finland. The Kriegsmarine had strategically begun laying mines several hours prior to the formal invasion, which quickly resulted in the loss of Soviet destroyers on the second day of the conflict. The swift German advance compelled the Soviet Navy to abandon its coastal bases and retreat towards Tallinn and Kronstadt, severely diminishing its operational capacity within the Baltic Sea. By mid-July of 1941, the Baltic Sea had become effectively a German-controlled body of water. To the south, Denmark and Norway were occupied by German troops, while Sweden maintained a stance of neutrality. Meanwhile, Finland was engaged in active combat against the Soviets, further isolating the Red Navy. With such limited maneuverability, the Soviet Baltic fleet found itself in a precarious position. Though the Germans had lost the battleship Bismarck in May, and then the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen was temporarily sidelined after sustaining a bomb hit in Brest later that month, they still maintained naval supremacy. The formidable battleship Tirpitz, more powerful than anything the Red Navy could field, was expressly assigned to deter any potential actions from the Soviet fleet. As the situation deteriorated for the Soviets, the Baltic fleet was soon forced into a defensive posture, effectively mining itself into their bases at Kronstadt and Leningrad. This entrapment only heightened the desperation of the Red Navy, restricting their ability to respond to the rapid German advances. As we unravel the intricate dynamics of naval power in this conflict, it becomes clear how critical control of the Baltic Sea was to the overall objectives of both the Axis and Soviet forces. Meanwhile, there was also the Black Sea, which was quite a different story. It was far more open than the Baltic, offering the Red Navy more room to operate freely. However, the Black Sea also had a plethora of naval powers in it, many of which were Axis members. Overall, for the Axis, to brutally summarize, Romania had 4 destroyers, 4 torpedo boats, 3 mine layers, 3 gunboats, 1 submarine tender, and 8 submarines. Germany had 16 torpedo boats, 6 submarines, and over 100 landing craft, focused on protecting supply routes. Italy had 7 torpedo boats, 6 submarines. Bulgaria had 11 torpedo boats, 5 anti-submarine crafts, involved in escort duties, and Croatia had 12 anti-submarine craft as well. Meanwhile, the Soviet Black Fleet was significantly stronger, comprising 1 battleship, Parizhskaya Kommuna, 6 cruisers, including the Molotov and Borislav, destroyer leaders, these being 3 of the Kharkov class, Moskova and Tashkent, modern destroyers, about 11 of them, older destroyers, about 5, about 15 smaller multi-purpose vessels, 44 submarines, and about 84 motor torpedo boats. On June the 26th, the Soviet forces launched an audacious attack on Constanta, a strategic port city located on the western coast of the Black Sea in Romania. This operation was marked by significant naval engagements. The Soviet destroyer leader, Moskva, tragically met its fate, striking mines while skillfully evading intense fire from Axis coastal artillery and destroyers lurking in the region. Throughout the conflict, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet played a vital role, particularly in its efforts to support the besieged garrison at Odessa, another essential port city to the northwest of Constanta. As the summer waned into October, the fleet managed to evacuate a staggering number of personnel, including approximately 86,000 soldiers and 150,000 civilians. However, this miraculous operation came at a cost, with the loss of the destroyer Frunz and a gunboat, both succumbing to German dive bombers during the evacuation. The tragedy intensified by November the 7th when the Soviet hospital ship Armenia was bombed and sunk by German aircraft, leading to the heartbreaking loss of over 5,000 lives, most of whom were civilians and patients desperately trying to escape the conflict. As the battle for control in the region intensified, the Black Sea Fleet proved instrumental in mounting a formidable defense of Sevastopol, a critical naval base located on the Crimean Peninsula. Going even further in time, in December of 1941, a daring amphibious operation was launched against the nearby Kerch Peninsula, resulting in the recapture of the strategically important landform. This operation was bolstered by a naval detachment that included the cruiser Krasny Krim, which remained in Sevastopol to provide critical gunfire support against incoming. Soviet submarines extended their reach, executing successful raids against Axis shipping along the coasts of Romania and Bulgaria, sinking approximately 29,000 long tons of enemy vessels. This period also saw both the Soviet and Axis forces laying extensive minefields in the southern Black Sea. Notably, Romanian defensive minefields accounted for the sinking of at least 5 Soviet submarines, specifically the M58, S-34, SHCH-211, the M34, and the M59. Within this chaos of naval warfare, the Axis forces also faced their own setbacks. The Romanian mine layer, Regal Carol I, was lost to a mine laid by the Soviet submarine L-4. Ironically, 2 out of 5 Soviet submarines that had perished in the previous minefield encounters ultimately met their end in the very fields that followed the sinking of said mine layer. In total, until the end of the war, Romanian defensive minefields claimed the lives of up to 15 Soviet submarines. Additionally, the Romanian Navy suffered quite a few losses of its own, including the mine layer Aurora, which was destroyed by Soviet bombers on July the 15th, further escalating the tensions and losses experienced by both sides in World War II. Now, the last naval theater relevant to the Eastern Front was the Arctic Ocean. In response to Operation Barbarossa, Britain and the Soviet Union forged a crucial alliance, known as the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, in July of that year. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, Britain swiftly began to provide significant material aid to the USSR starting in August. This support included essential supplies such as tanks and aircraft, all aimed at bolstering their new allies' capacity to resist the relentless advance of the Axis forces. A primary route for this vital support effort was through Iran, where both nations collaborated as part of a joint occupation beginning in late August. This maneuver was crucial to neutralize German influence in the region, which could potentially threaten Allied interest. The importance of the Allied cooperation was further underscored when in September the Soviet Union participated in the Second Inter-Allied Conference in London. This event symbolized the USSR's emergence as one of the big 3 allies in World War II, alongside Britain and from December onwards the United States. These 3 nations would unite their efforts in a concerted fight against the Axis powers, fundamentally altering the course of the war. Additionally, a key component of this alliance was the American lend-lease program, which was signed into law in March of 1941. This program provided both Britain and the Soviet Union with critical war material starting in October that same year. As war progressed, lend-lease scaled up significantly during 1943, supplying the Allies with the resources necessary to sustain their war effort. In reciprocation, the British Empire, along with the Soviet Union, albeit on a smaller scale, implemented a reverse lend-lease program, which aimed them to provide aid and resources back to the United States. This mutual support amongst the Allies showcased the collaborative spirit that was essential for overcoming the formidable challenges posed by the Axis powers. On June the 25th of 1941, the Soviet troop ship Mosovet arrived at Titovka, delivering much-needed reinforcements to bolster the Soviet defenses in the face of the advancing Axis forces. Just 5 days later, on June the 30th, the Soviet destroyers Kuibyshev and Ritsky had landed additional troops, highlighting the urgency of the situation as the war intensified. Moving into July, the German U-boats began to establish their presence in the Arctic. On July the 1st, U-451 and U-652 were the first submarines to be stationed in these frigid waters, poised for operations that would challenge Soviet shipping and naval activity. On July the 12th, the Kriegsmarine escalated its aggressive tactics. A flotilla of destroyers comprising Lichtenbetzen, Hermann Schumann, Hans Lode, Friedrich Eckardt, and Karl Galsta launched a surprise attack on a small Soviet convoy near Cape Teribusky, further showcasing the increasing tension in this vital maritime region. 2 days later, on July 14th, a counteraction by the Soviet naval forces was initiated. Destroyers Kromky, Grimyasny, Smolensk, and Kobyeshev engaged the enemy, successfully delaying a German infantry advance near the Sabannaya Litsa River, which runs through the Murmansk region of Russia. This timely intervention helped to buy precious time for the Soviet ground forces. Tragically, on July the 20th, the Soviet destroyer Smolensk met a grim fate in the Kola Bay, where it was sunk by German Junkers 87 dive bombers. This event signified the growing air threat that the Soviets faced during naval operations. The situation only worsened for the Soviet fleet on July the 23rd when the Kriegsmarine destroyers, the Chudbetsen, Hermann Schumann, Friedrich Eichhold, and Karl Galsta successfully sank the Soviet survey ship Meriden near Tubrieka, a small fishing village along the Arctic coast. In a rather bold move, British naval forces were instrumental in escalating the air conflict. On July the 30th, aircraft from the HMS Furious and Victorious launched airstrikes on the strategic ports of Petsamon-Kukene, located in northeastern Norway, near the border with Russia. The following day, on July 31st, HMS Victorious conducted an airstrike on Tromsø, turning back a German patrol of destroyers. Further demonstrating their operational capabilities, British warships, including the HMS Nigeria, Aurora, Punjabi, and Tartar, destroyed a weather station on Bear Island, a small but remote island located between Norway and Svalbard. These actions underscored the multifaceted naval warfare that characterized the summer of 1941, as both the Axis and Allied forces vied for control in regions crucial to their strategic objectives. Now, taking a look back at the ground forces, Army Group North found itself in a precarious position following a series of setbacks, particularly after the confident maneuvers of General Heinrich von Manstein had led his Panzer Corps to suffer heavy losses at Solzhenitsyn. Nevertheless, despite these challenges, Manstein had managed to preserve his divisions, and the situation had not yet tilted decisively against Army Group North. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Leber, commanding the group, retained a strong force that was poised to continue its advance towards the strategic city of Leningrad. However, Leib knew it was crucial to pause and reassess his forces. In the last few weeks, Army Group North had pushed forward nearly 600 kilometers. Yet they still found themselves over 100 kilometers from their objective, that being Leningrad. As the infantry caught up with the armored divisions, it became clear that the panzers needed much-needed rest and maintenance, while the entire strategic plan required a thorough reevaluation. Compounding these challenges was the fact that Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, remained unconquered. This not only represented a significant strategic vulnerability, but also a potential threat to the rear of Army Group North. Furthermore, the Finnish forces, who were initially expected to help secure a link-up with the German troops around Leningrad, were slowing their advance. As Colonel General Erich Hopna wrote to his wife on July 16th of his dissatisfaction with the halted drive on Leningrad, "The deciding cause remains our weakness. The number of divisions is as inadequate as their equipment. The men are tired. Losses are increasing. The fallout rate of vehicles rises." This hesitation complicated future plans for coordinated operations that allowed the Red Army to regroup and fortify its defenses. In fact, the threat of a complete collapse in the north was beginning to recede. The Northwestern Front was desperately working to reinforce the defenses of Leningrad. They were effectively utilizing the time gained from General Nikolai Vaturin's assault on Solzhenitsyn, continuing to funnel significant reserves into the region. However, the influx of troops was hampered by the emergency transfer of 4 rifle divisions to the northern front, which needed bolstering to defend the key area between Lake Ladogo to the southwest and Lake Onega further to the northwest. The region was experiencing the highest concentration of Finnish forces, and the Red Army was stretched quite thin as it sought soldiers to contain the enemy's advances. Amidst these pressing challenges, the Stavka sent an inspection team to assess the Luga defenses, concluding that they were wholly inadequate for the imminent threat of an attack. Consequently, the Northern Front was tasked with reinforcing these critical defensive positions, but this was no simple undertaking. While command of the defensive construction in the region was unified to streamline efforts, the Stavka intervened regularly, signaling the importance of maintaining a robust defensive line. Disagreements regarding the optimal location and depth of these fortifications often led to inefficiencies. However, overall progress was being made. With each passing day, the stakes heightened as the forces clashed not only with the enemy, but also grappling with the harsh realities of war. adaptability, and the urgent need for logistical support and strategic foresight. In the second week of July of 1941, the Stavka issued critical orders for the reorganization of the Red Army's field forces and chain of command. By the third week of July, these orders were finally being implemented, leading to significant changes across the board. The last of the Red Army's mechanized corps were disbanded, and in a sweeping reform, all corps headquarters were dissolved. The new structure established a direct control model in which field armies were given direct oversight of their divisions, resulting in a streamlined organization that reduced the overall number of divisions per army to only 5 or 6. Previously, some armies had managed as many as 9 divisions, a situation that had become unsustainable in the face of the war's escalating demands. These changes were not arbitrary. They were crafted in response to 2 critical realities on the Eastern Front. The first was the glaring inadequacy of the Red Army's command and control capabilities. This deficiency stemmed from several issues, including outdated communication technologies available to commanders, incomplete or non-existent reconnaissance efforts, and the lack of experience amongst many of its officers. A considerable number of poorly trained and inexperienced individuals occupied senior positions, hampering effective leadership. Although there were improvements underway, the reality remained that command is a nuanced skill that requires time and experience to master, a luxury that was dwindling as promising officers and men were lost in the relentless battles across the front. The second important factor prompting this organizational shakeup was the necessity for field armies to become more agile. As the German Panzer Corps demonstrated their capacity for rapid movement and swift tactical shifts, it became clear that the Soviets needed to adapt to this new kind of warfare. While this agility related to the previously mentioned command issues, it also represented a separate understanding of the evolving battlefield dynamics. From the dawn of organized warfare, armies had grappled with finding the right balance between mass and maneuverability. Each war brings its own set of conditions that can shift the balance dramatically. The Red Army's efforts to reorganize its response to these emerging challenges underscored the reality that adaptability was vital for survival. Importantly, the Germans themselves had reconstructed their own forces prior to the onset of Operation Barbarossa, demonstrating their own acute awareness of the Eastern Front's complexities. By the end of the war, they, too, would undergo additional reorganizations in response to changing circumstances. Changes of this magnitude do not indicate incompetence, quite the opposite. Such reorganizations signal that a military leadership is actively trying to adapt to frontline conditions, aiming to maximize the potential capabilities of its field forces amidst the chaos of war. Now, Army Group Center remained focused on the critical battle for Smolensk, a city that had fallen into German hands and whose encirclement had not yet been fully secured. General Hans Guderian was tasked with closing the pocket on the southeastern side of the encirclement, but he had failed to execute this order in the previous week. Instead, he opted to push his forces further east, capturing the town of Yelna on July 20th. Yelna was key to Guderian's plans because it was a significant crossing across the Desna River. He evidently believed that he could get a jump on the Red Army by securing his next river crossing before the Soviets could even stop him. This decision would have significant consequences. Before Guderian could maneuver his 17th Panzer Division across the breach to link up with the units commanded by General Hermann Hoth, nearly 40,000 encircled Red Army soldiers managed to escape the pocket. While they succeeded in fleeing, they emerged with only a few scattered pieces of armor, equipment, and artillery, reflecting the dire situation of the Western Front, which lay in absolute shambles. In the aftermath of this defeat, the Stavka and General Georgy Timoshenko maintained a steadier composure than, let's say, General Andrei Pavlov, who had demonstrated his incompetence earlier in June. Positioned between Moscow and Smolensk, the reserve front was in place, though it was far from fully prepared for an all-out assault. Nonetheless, Timoshenko was allocated fresh units to pursue the retaking of Smolensk. To bolster his forces, the reserve front was effectively stripped of its strength, with 4 field armies, the 24th, 28th, 29th, and 30th, placed under his command. These newly reinforced armies launched their attack on German positions on July the 21st, marking a critical moment in the struggle for Smolensk. Compared to earlier assaults on the western defensive line, efforts to coordinate these new attacks were intensified. However, they still encountered significant challenges of collaboration. Nonetheless, Army Group Center was caught completely off guard by the ferocity of the Soviet counterattacks. The Soviets were able to muster vast new reserves of manpower and material, just as the Wehrmacht had begun to conclude that the Red Army was nearing its breaking point. This revelation, that the Red Army still possessed significant fighting spirit, was unsettling for many German officers and soldiers alike. At the forefront of this renewed Soviet effort was General Konstantin Rokossovsky, positioned at the core of Timoshenko's newly established line. For the initial days of the counteroffensive, he focused on halting the advance of the 7th Panzer Division at Yartsevo. Despite relentless attacks from the Luftwaffe, which worked to punish his men for their resilience, Rokossovsky's forces held their ground. Finally, on June the 24th, he was able to shift from a defensive posture to an offensive one. While the Soviet attacks did not manage to break through the lines of the Army Group Center, they inflicted significant casualties and disrupted German operations, effectively bloodying their nose. As the week drew to a close, the fighting continued to rage in the Smolensk region, yet it became increasingly evident that the Red Army would not be able to reclaim the city. Guderian had successfully sealed the encirclement pocket and captured Yelna, but this victory proved to create more problems than it actually solved. The success resulted in a bulge in the German lines, exacerbated by the Wehrmacht's inability to advance further into Ukraine. This left the entire southern flank of Army Group Center exposed, particularly to the east of the Pripyat marshes, a vast and treacherous lowland region that presented significant challenges for military movement. Despite the situation, the Red Army held firm along the line from Chernihiv to Roslav, maintaining a focused and significant resistance. Even after encircling 3 Soviet armies in front of Smolensk, the resilience of the Red Army weighed heavily on Adolf Hitler's mind as he sought decisive victories. In the final days of July, Yelna continued to attract serious attention from Soviet forces. On July 25th, Soviet tanks launched a bold offensive, breaking through the defenses of the 10th Panzer Division and the elite SS regiment, Die Großdeutschland, that was tasked with holding the area around Yelna. Only after intense fighting were the Soviet tanks pushed back, largely due to poor tactical control and coordination amongst the Soviet officers. The attackers had failed to integrate infantry units into their armored assault, leaving them vulnerable to the Wehrmacht's superior combined arms approach. Later that same day, General Kurt von Schleicher's 4th Army attempted to dispatch an infantry regiment to relieve the besieged panzers at Yelna. However, during this movement, the 485th Regiment was ambushed by the Soviet 149th Rifle Division, which was attacking from within the Smolensk pocket. The German infantry found themselves caught completely off guard, and within hours, 2 of their battalions were encircled by the relentless Soviet assault. They sent a desperate request for support, but this was denied, leaving them to fend for themselves. The situation became increasingly dire at the front lines of Army Group Center, with the realization that there simply weren't enough men to reinforce positions or mount an effective counteroffensive. The reserves of the 4th Army had been stretched too thin, leaving battalions with no choice but to fight their way out of the encirclement. This grueling effort took 2 full days, but finally on July the 27th, they managed to retreat back to the German lines. In the coming weeks, it became abundantly clear that Guderian's bridgehead at Yelna would weigh heavily on Army Group Center, proving to be a milestone that would complicate their efforts and drag down their momentum as they sought to advance further into Soviet territory. The fighting in Ukraine remained fiercely concentrated around the developing encirclement at Uman. On July the 21st, the Soviets launched a significant armored strike at Majestic, igniting intense combat that continued throughout the following week. The 2nd and 24th Mechanized Corps of the Red Army put forth a commendable effort, engaging with the formidable forces of the 11th and 16th Panzer Divisions, in addition to the elite SS division known as Die Leibstande SS, Adolf Hitler. This clash represented a critical confrontation in the broader context of the Eastern Front, as Soviet forces sought to disrupt the German encirclement and reclaim some lost ground. Despite facing heavily armored opponents, the Soviet mechanized units demonstrated resilience and tactical acumen, but the outcome of the struggle would ultimately hinge on the larger strategies at play in the region. As for that SS division, it would actually be redesignated as the 1st SS Panzer Division, though it would retain its longer name, often abbreviated as the LSSAH. At this point in the war, there were only a few division-sized SS units, and they were predominantly known by names rather than formal numerical designations. The military growth of the SS, particularly in its Waffen-SS form, warrants a more extensive discussion that can't be fully addressed here yet. However, it's important to highlight that the Waffen-SS, as a military arm of the SS, was never truly considered elite, or in a military sense at least. These units did not receive any specialized training, and they were generally equipped in the same standards as their Wehrmacht counterparts. What set them apart was their perceived political reliability, as the members met the Nazi regime's racial criteria, which had no correlation to their military skill or potential. Throughout the conflict, SS divisions were notorious for committing war crimes at rates that far exceeded those of the regular Wehrmacht units. The 9th Panzer Division to the north had previously launched a decisive attack against the 16th and 24th Mechanized Corps as they were retreating. Despite this pressure, the Soviets managed to maintain their composure and held their lines. However, this did not mean the 9th Panzer were being stalled, quite the opposite. The capture of the small rural town of Novokalhetsk, located east of Uman, signified that the encirclement was closing from north and east. As the fighting at Monastlich came to an end, the SS LSSAH moved in to help secure the town against a weak counterattack from the remnants of the 4th Mechanized Corps. While the panzers were managing the northern eastern flanks of the encirclement, the 17th Army advanced from the west and the south. By the end of the week, the encirclement of the 6th and 12th Soviet armies had been successfully completed. While the process of liquidation would take much longer, it was clear that another German victory had been secured. 5 mechanized corps and 2 Soviet armies had been all but destroyed, with the last of the Soviet armor on this side of the Dnieper River eliminated. The southwestern and southern fronts had suffered catastrophic losses, totaling around 200,000 men. This was yet another immense disaster that deserved mention alongside the encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, marking it as one of the greatest encirclement battles of 1941. Strategically, the prospects for the Soviets to hold back Army Group South east of Kiev were quite bleak. Although there remained cleanup operations to conduct before launching an assault on Ukraine's capital, both sides recognized it was only a matter of time before Army Group South would make another attempt to capture the city. So far, the Eastern Front could only be described as a shocking defeat for the Red Army. In the first 5 weeks of the war, the Soviet Union had lost hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of territory. 3 most critical cities, Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow, were now perilously close to the advancing German forces. Kiev was within striking distance of the panzers, while the Germans measured their distance to Leningrad in dozens of kilometers rather than hundreds. Moscow lay just 350 kilometers away from some points of the front. The battles of Uman, Smolensk, and Minsk had been complete disasters, resulting in millions of casualties across various categories. Some of the best equipment and most capable units of the Red Army had been thrown into the battle. They were completely squandered. Desperate defensive actions seemed to only delay the inevitable, as the Wehrmacht continued its relentless advance eastward. Throughout this chaos, many officers had proven to be completely incompetent, leading to the loss of tens of thousands of lives due to their ignorance of the most fundamental tenets of tactical maneuvering. Yet not all hope was lost. The soldiers of the Red Army displayed remarkable bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. Quite contrary to Hitler's predictions, the Soviet state was proving to be resilient, refusing to collapse when the Wehrmacht had so-called kicked in the door. Instead, it had raised a dozen new armies, negotiated treaties with Hitler's enemies, and steeled itself for a prolonged struggle. While conditions were dire and likely to worsen, Stalin's government surpassed global expectations. The people of the Soviet Union demonstrated their willingness to fight and defend their nation. By the end of July, no one was under the illusion that the situation for the Red Army was turning around. However, there remained a flicker of hope for victory, as a path forward to at least halt the advance of the Wehrmacht began to form. For Hitler, the war was developing in the opposite direction. A few leaders within the Wehrmacht or the Nazi regime were insightful enough to recognize it, and many feared the impending realization. At every turn, the Wehrmacht had concluded battles with indisputable victories. The panzers had driven deep into the heart of the Soviet Union, crushing all opposition and facilitating some of the most one-sided battles in modern military history. Yet a shadow was creeping in around the edges of their success. As July came to a close, the Wehrmacht's total casualties in the east approached 175,000 men, while only 77,000 replacement soldiers had been dispatched to the front. The panzers were now over 700 kilometers away from their easternmost railway heads, leading to a long delay in resupply, increased wear and tear on the supply trucks, and a steady decline in the combat effectiveness of their forward units. Tanks that lacked spare parts had to be abandoned, leaving a burdensome concern for the immediate strength of the fighting units, unaffected by the prospect of future resupply. The panzer divisions were the essential component of Hitler's military strategy. Without them, the victories of June and July would not have been possible. As the end of July approached, he and his generals were forced to confront the unsettling possibility that they might not have the strength needed to finish the job. I would like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, about 28 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Despite initial victories, the Wehrmacht underestimated Soviet tenacity. Intense battles raged around Smolensk, where German troops encircled the city, only to be met with fierce Soviet counterattacks led by General Timoshenko. The Red Army adapted with strategic reforms and relocated factories to sustain their productivity. Though Smolensk had fallen, Germany's momentum was beginning to falter. The harsh realities of warfare and evolving tactics suggested a critical turning point, hinting at a future challenge for the Wehrmacht in the relentless campaign across the Eastern Front.